My name is Harold M. Ellison. I am 82 years old, a retired mechanic, and a veteran of the Vietnam War. For the past 12 years, I have lived in a modest single-story house on the outskirts of Springfield, Missouri, where I moved shortly after my wife Lorna passed away. She died in her sleep on a cold January night, holding my hand even in unconsciousness, the way she used to whenever I woke from one of those old war dreams that clung to me like cobwebs in the dark. After her funeral, the silence in our home became unbearable, as if every corner of the house echoed with the absence of her voice, her footsteps, her laughter. I tried to fill the emptiness with routine: early mornings, breakfast at the same table, the same brand of cereal, always 2 cups of black coffee, one of which I still poured for her out of habit, letting it go cold. The television stayed off most days. I had no taste for the noise. My only regular company came from a tabby cat named Cinnamon, who started showing up on my porch the summer after Lorna died. I fed him tuna once, and he never left. He sleeps now in her recliner chair, the one with the faded red upholstery, the chair where she used to knit and rock herself slowly to sleep. 2 years ago, I fell on the porch while trying to change the light bulb in the motion detector above the garage. I heard something snap in my hip before I hit the ground. They called it a pelvic fracture, and I spent nearly 4 months in a rehabilitation center filled with the smell of antiseptics and the quiet moans of people who had long given up on speaking to one another. My daughter Diane came to see me once a week, always on Thursdays, always at 11 a.m. on the dot. She'd bring coffee from that chain she liked, the one with the green mermaid logo, and sit stiffly in the plastic visitor's chair by my bed, scrolling through her phone in one hand while holding my cold hand in the other. It wasn't unkindness. It was detachment, a gentle indifference, like petting a dog you don't really like but don't have the heart to kick out. Her husband Gerald never came, not once. He said it was too depressing. After I was discharged, the doctor gave me a titanium cane and a warning. "Don't try to be a hero, Mr. Ellison," he said. "You're not 25 anymore." He meant well, but something in me rebelled at those words. I was a man who had built car engines from scratch, who had walked through jungles in monsoon rains, who had held his wife through the worst of her cancer and watched her vanish inch by inch. And yet now I needed assistance to reach the bathroom. Eventually, the cane became insufficient. My balance had worsened. One morning I lost control on the wet kitchen floor and landed hard on my side. I broke 2 ribs. The doctors insisted on a wheelchair, and my daughter agreed enthusiastically. "It's safer, Dad," she said, patting my hand as if I were a piece of fragile porcelain. "We just want you to be comfortable." But comfort, I found, was a quiet prison. Once I sat in that chair, I stopped being a man in her eyes. I became a burden to be wheeled around, lifted, placed, and parked. Even my visits to her house became choreographed events. Gerald would open the trunk, unfold the ramp with the efficiency of someone performing an irritating weekly task, and wheel me through the side door as if I were an appliance being delivered. At dinner, I was placed at the corner of the table where I wouldn't be in the way, and most conversations took place above and around me. Occasionally Diane would look down and ask, "You okay, Dad?" And I'd nod, because saying anything more would only bring silence or correction. Their daughter, my granddaughter Molly, was different. She was the only reason I still accepted invitations to those Sunday dinners. Molly would sit with me in the sunroom after the meal, talking to me like I still mattered, asking about Lorna and about the old garage where I used to work, about the stories of cars and customers and the tricks I used to teach her when she was little, how to change a tire, how to tell if brake pads were worn. She had that same fire Lorna had, the same mischievous smirk, and that gift of looking you straight in the eye when she spoke. She called me Gramps, and not Dad's dad, or grandfather, just Gramps, like we had a secret alliance. When she told me about her engagement to Travis, I felt something warm break open inside me. She was 27, full of life, a nurse at the local hospital, and deeply in love. She told me about how he proposed during a picnic in the state park, how he'd hidden the ring in a thermos lid, and how she nearly swallowed it with her lemonade. I laughed harder than I had in months. She said she wanted me at the wedding. "Front row, center," she added with a wink. "And you're walking me down the aisle, Gramps. No arguments." I laughed, but my throat tightened. "You know I can't walk far," I said. She squeezed my hand. "Then you'll roll me down the aisle and I'll roll you right back. Deal?" We shook on it. That promise kept me awake most nights. I knew I couldn't walk her down the aisle like I'd once walked Diane into her graduation hall, but I was determined to be there. I cleaned my old navy blue suit. I polished my shoes, even though I hadn't worn them in years. I practiced moving from the chair to the walker and from the walker to the front door without anyone's help. It took effort. My bones ached with each movement, but the thought of Molly in her white dress, looking back and smiling at me as I escorted her down the aisle, that image lit a fire inside me that no medicine could ever reproduce. I told Diane about it one afternoon. I said I wanted to be a part of the ceremony, not just a distant guest. She paused, that pause that always came before something she didn't want to say. "Dad, I don't know if that's a good idea. The venue has steps. It's a bit of a hassle, and we're already dealing with a lot of logistics." I said I could manage, that I'd practice, that I wouldn't make a scene. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We'll talk about it," she said, which in Diane's speak always meant no. Still, I held on to hope. Molly continued to visit, bringing sketches of her dress, pictures of the flower arrangements, even letting me help her choose the song for the father-daughter dance. "You're still part of this, Gramps," she'd say. "Don't let Mom steamroll you." I didn't tell her about the conversation with Diane. I didn't want to spoil her joy. I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, Diane would come around. Maybe on the morning of the wedding I'd be wheeled into that chapel, lifted proudly into the moment I had earned with a lifetime of love. I didn't yet know that my own daughter had already made sure that wouldn't happen. I didn't know that the chair I relied on to move, to breathe, to live, would disappear on the morning of the wedding without a trace or explanation. And I didn't know that despite the betrayal, the humiliation, the pain, I would still find a way to stand. The morning of Molly's wedding arrived beneath a sky the color of old silver, heavy clouds promising rain that would never come. I had been awake since before dawn, not out of anxiety but out of ritual. I had prepared for this day with the same quiet determination I once reserved for setting an engine block into a frame or repairing a carburetor by hand. Slow, precise, methodical. My suit was already laid out from the night before, draped neatly across the back of the living room couch. I had shined the shoes one last time until the worn leather reflected the low ceiling light. The tie had taken me longer. My fingers weren't what they used to be, but I managed a decent Windsor knot and left it hanging over the doorknob. The boutonniere, a single white carnation that Molly had dropped off herself 2 days earlier, waited in a small glass of water on the kitchen counter. I had charged the chair overnight and checked the wheels for dust and debris, the way I used to inspect my tools before a big job. Everything was in order. All I had to do was wait for Diane to arrive and help me into the car like we had arranged. The church was 20 minutes away, a small Methodist chapel built in the 1950s, simple but dignified. Molly had chosen it for its stained-glass windows and the fact that it reminded her of the one in which I had married Lorna 57 years ago. I was proud of that detail. She had said it as if it were a tribute. I looked at the clock, 9:12 a.m. Diane was supposed to pick me up at 9 sharp. It was unlike her to be late. She lived by her calendar with the devotion of a priest. I waited 10 more minutes, then rolled to the front door and opened it just enough to peer outside. The driveway was empty, no car, no sound. I went back inside, sat quietly, and stared at the television screen, which was off. I didn't want to call her, didn't want to seem impatient, but I started to feel that prickle behind my ears, the one that always came when something was off. At 9:30, I picked up the phone and dialed her number. It rang twice before going to voicemail. I left a message, calm and simple. "Hi, sweetheart, just checking in. I'm dressed and ready. Let me know if you're running late." I tried to keep my voice cheerful. I looked down at myself, straightened the crease of my pants, checked the boutonniere again. Everything was perfect, except she wasn't here. By 10 o'clock, I started to worry. I wheeled myself to the garage to double-check my emergency walker. It was still there, leaning against the shelf where I kept the winter salt and old paint cans. Then I looked at the usual spot where I parked my chair when I came home. It was empty. I turned back toward the house, confused. Then I stopped cold. The chair was gone, not the walker, the wheelchair. My main chair, the one with the adjustable back, the handbrakes, the padded seat cushion. It wasn't in the living room, not in the bedroom, not on the back porch. I searched everywhere, twice, 3 times. My heart began to pound, not with panic, but with the slow realization of something deeper. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had removed it. There had been no visitors other than Diane in the last few days. She had brought groceries, checked the thermostat, and left. I had assumed, as always, that she was being kind in her cold, efficient way. But now, as I stood in the center of my home, gripping the walker for balance, a creeping suspicion began to bloom inside me like a dark bruise. I called her again. Voicemail. I left another message, firmer this time. Diane, the wheelchair is missing. I can't find it anywhere. Please call me back as soon as you get this. I tried to keep the shake out of my voice, tried not to believe what I already knew. I moved to the kitchen and sat at the edge of the table, gripping the walker with one hand while the other shook slightly as I reached for a glass of water. The cat meowed at my feet, sensing my agitation. I reached down to pet him, but the gesture felt robotic, meaningless. I waited. At 10:45, the doorbell rang. Diane stood there in a beige trench coat, hair done up, makeup perfect. Behind her, in the driveway, Gerald waited in the driver's seat of the sedan, engine running. She didn't greet me. She didn't smile. She walked in like a realtor showing a house. "Are you ready?" she asked, and I stared at her for a long moment before answering. "Where is my chair?" I asked. She blinked, once, slowly. "What do you mean?" "My wheelchair is gone. It's not here. It was in the house yesterday. Did you move it?" She looked away for a moment toward the car, then back at me with a manufactured softness. "Dad, we thought it would be better if today you just stayed home. The venue's too tight. There are stairs and ramps aren't reliable in the rain. You know how much Molly has on her plate today. She doesn't need any complications." I stared at her, not speaking. "It's only for today," she added quickly, as if that made it better. "You can see the photos later. I'll bring you cake." I didn't move. My hands gripped the walker so tightly I could feel the metal vibrating. "She asked me to walk her down the aisle," I said, my voice steady. "I made her a promise," Diane sighed, a long, slow exhale filled with practiced patience. "That was just sentimental, Dad. She didn't really mean it. She was being sweet. She's okay with it. We talked about it. You'll see her later at the reception." She turned toward the door. "Now I really need to go. We're already late. I'll have Gerald bring you some lunch." And then she was gone. Just like that. As if I had been a patient refusing to take his meds. As if I were a child who had thrown a tantrum. I stood there for a long time, not sitting, not moving, gripping the walker until my knuckles turned white. The silence in the house was deafening. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice, Lorna's voice, whispered, "Don't let them take this from you." It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry. It was calm, loving, steady, like her. I turned slowly and hobbled toward the hall closet, the one with the sliding door that always stuck a little on the left side. Inside, behind old winter coats and a broken vacuum cleaner, was a long, narrow box I hadn't touched in over 20 years. I reached for it, pulled it out slowly, opened the lid. Inside lay a single wooden cane, no rubber grip, no ergonomic padding, just a polished oak stick with a curved handle and the initials H.E. carved into the base. It was a gift from my platoon after I retired. I had never used it for more than decoration. Now it was my only option. With the walker under one arm and the cane in the other, I began to move, slowly, deliberately, each step sending fire through my hips and thighs, but I moved. I made it to the bedroom, finished dressing, fixed my tie, pinned the boutonniere to my lapel. Then I called a cab. Not Diane, not Gerald. A yellow cab from a company I remembered from before smartphones took over the world. The driver arrived 20 minutes later, a young man named Samir with wide, concerned eyes. He offered to help me into the car, and I let him, not out of weakness, but necessity. As he drove, I gave him the address of the chapel and said nothing else. My breath was shallow, my palms slick with sweat, but my jaw was set. I didn't know what I would find when I got there. I didn't know if they would let me in or if I would collapse in the aisle before I reached her. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would not let this be stolen from me, not by time, not by weakness, and certainly not by my own daughter. When the cab pulled up to the curb in front of the church, I could already hear the distant swell of organ music drifting through the open double doors. Guests in suits and pastel dresses milled about on the sidewalk, fanning themselves with programs, laughing in soft voices, eyes darting toward the entrance with the kind of expectant joy weddings summon like clockwork. I sat for a moment in the back seat, breathing through the burning pain in my hip, sweat pooling at the base of my neck beneath my collar. My right hand locked tightly around the curve of my old oak cane. My driver, Samir, looked back and asked gently if I wanted help getting out. I nodded, not out of pride, but because speaking felt dangerous, like any sound would crack open the fragile shell I had wrapped around myself just to stay upright. With his help, I stepped out of the cab and into the morning heat, every movement deliberate, every step weighted with something far heavier than bone or muscle. I stood there, framed by the late summer breeze and the unfamiliar stares of wedding guests I didn't recognize, and it occurred to me for the first time that I didn't know whether my name had been included in the program, whether I was still considered part of the wedding or merely a footnote in the bride's ancestry. A name whispered when someone asks, "Who's that old man?" But I didn't turn back. I adjusted my jacket, lifted my chin, and began the slow, uneven walk toward the church steps. The building loomed ahead, modest in size but grand in emotion. It was the kind of place built for ceremony, where every creak of the pews and flicker of candlelight seemed to whisper of promises made and broken, of generations passing like hands through water. As I reached the stairs, a young usher stepped forward, clearly startled to see me. He was barely out of high school, acne beneath his bow tie, clipboard in hand. "Sir, do you need assistance?" "The ceremony is starting," he began, but I cut him off with a look that said more than words could have. He faltered, then stepped aside. I gripped the railing with one hand, my cane in the other, and began the agonizing climb, each stair a mountain, each pause a battle against the fire in my joints. I could feel the eyes of the guests on me, some curious, others awkwardly averted, all silent. No one moved to help, but no one blocked me either. When I reached the doors, I paused to catch my breath and saw my reflection in the glass, stooped, sweat-streaked, wild-eyed, but standing. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The chapel was already full. The string quartet had just started playing the processional, a soft, sweeping melody that carried through the wood-paneled space like smoke. I spotted Gerald near the front, standing stiffly in a black suit, his eyes locked on the minister. Diane sat beside him, her face frozen in a half-smile, hands clutching her clutch purse like it was a lifeline. And then I saw Molly, radiant in her gown, framed at the back of the aisle by the arched doorway, her veil lifted, a trembling smile on her lips. Our eyes met across the length of the church, and something passed between us, shock, recognition, and then an almost imperceptible nod, as if she'd been waiting for me all along. She took a breath and stepped forward. The music swelled, the guests turned, and I began to walk. I didn't need a cue or an invitation. I took my place beside her, offering my arm the way I had practiced in the kitchen, in the hallway, even in my dreams. She took it without hesitation, without a word, her grip firm, eyes brimming. I looked straight ahead and started down the aisle with her, step by agonizing step, the congregation parting around us like water, a wave of murmurs rising, then falling into reverent silence. I couldn't feel the pain anymore. All I felt was her hand on mine and the weight of her promise kept, not by convenience, but by defiance. When we reached the altar, I kissed her forehead and placed her hand in Travis's. He looked at me with something like awe and mouthed, "Thank you." I didn't respond. I turned and walked to the nearest pew and sat down slowly, the ache rushing back into my body like a flood. But it didn't matter. I was there. I had walked her down the aisle. The ceremony passed in a blur. I remember fragments, vows spoken, a tear on Molly's cheek, the way the light hit the stained glass and scattered across the faces of strangers. But what I remember most is the way Diane never looked at me, not once. Not during the readings, not during the kiss, not even as guests stood to applaud. She kept her eyes forward, lips tight, her body rigid as a statue. Gerald glanced at me only once, and his face was a mask of disbelief and fury. After the recessional, I stood slowly, steadying myself with the cane, and made my way outside. I didn't plan to stay long. I'd done what I came to do. But then I saw Molly rushing toward me, bouquet in one hand, veil bunched in the other, her heels clicking on the pavement. She threw her arms around me and whispered, "Gramps, I can't believe you made it." I smiled, more with my eyes than my mouth. "I made a promise," I said, "and I keep my word." She wanted me to join the family photos. I agreed, despite the way Diane's face blanched when she saw me step into frame beside Molly and Travis. The photographer, a polite young woman with thick glasses, didn't bat an eye. She posed us carefully, even giving me a seat on the edge of the bridal party, making sure I was visible. Gerald stood stiffly behind me, his hand barely grazing Diane's waist. No one said anything during the photos, but I could feel the tension rise like heat off asphalt. After the final picture, I quietly stepped aside and began making my way toward the rear of the property, where the reception tent was set up. The path was uneven, and every step sent shards of pain through my pelvis, but I kept walking, slowly, stubbornly, until I reached a bench beneath a sycamore tree. I sat alone for several minutes, letting the world settle around me, catching my breath, adjusting the boutonniere that had wilted slightly. Then Diane appeared. She didn't sit. She hovered. Her face was pale, her expression sharp. "What are you doing?" she asked. Not angrily, just flat, like an interrogation. "You weren't supposed to come. You weren't supposed to do this." I looked up at her, letting the silence stretch long enough to make her uncomfortable. "You took my chair," I said. She didn't deny it. She crossed her arms, eyes darting toward the reception tent. "It was for your own good. You could have hurt yourself. You're not stable anymore." "We didn't want you to fall or embarrass Molly," I laughed, short and bitter. "Embarrass her? You mean embarrass you." Her mouth twisted. "Dad, we had everything planned. You coming here like this, it's disruptive. People are going to talk." I stood slowly, deliberately, leaning heavily on the cane. "Let them talk," I said. "Let them say they saw an old man keep a promise." She stared at me for a long moment, something flickering behind her eyes. Anger, maybe guilt, maybe fear. But she said nothing more. She turned and walked away, her heels sinking into the grass, her figure swallowed by the crowd now gathering around the buffet tables and the open bar. I didn't follow. I didn't want champagne or cake or polite applause. I just wanted air. I turned away from the tent toward the edge of the property where the land dipped into a wooded slope. I stood there, cane in hand, watching the trees shift in the breeze, feeling more alive than I had in years. My legs trembled beneath me, but I stayed upright, alone but not ashamed, in pain but not diminished. I had come here for Molly, and I had come for myself. I had been erased, but I wrote myself back into the story, not with vengeance, not with violence, but with this quiet, stubborn dignity of standing when no one thought I could. I remained at the edge of the woods for what must have been nearly an hour, long enough for the music from the reception tent to shift from classical string arrangements to those hollow, celebratory pop songs that seemed to bounce off the air like empty promises. I could hear the distant sounds of forks clinking on china, bursts of laughter that rang a little too loudly, a microphone squeal followed by some poor best man's nervous toast. The sky had begun to dim, not quite sunset, but leaning into it. That strange hour where light loses its warmth and starts to feel like memory. My legs were screaming, my arms stiff from the unrelenting grip on the cane, my body shaking from adrenaline and fatigue, but I didn't move. I was afraid that if I sat down, I wouldn't be able to stand again. There was something dangerous about the stillness growing inside me, like the realization that I had crossed a line and could not uncross it, not in their eyes, not in Diane's. I knew what I had done wasn't dramatic in any theatrical sense, but to them it was an act of rebellion, a refusal to be silent, and people like Diane don't forgive refusal. They tolerate obedience, reward silence, praise the willingness to step aside. But I had made myself visible. Worse, I had made myself human again. Eventually, I turned and began the long, slow walk back to the front of the property. The reception was in full swing now. Tables covered in white linen were cluttered with half-eaten slices of cake and sweating glasses of Prosecco. Children ran between legs with chocolate-stained faces. Elderly relatives I hadn't seen in decades sat near the back, watching everything with the exhausted detachment of people who had already been to too many weddings. And in the center, Diane stood near a tall floral arrangement, whispering furiously to Gerald, her arms folded tightly, her entire posture radiating tension like a coiled spring. I didn't approach her. I didn't approach anyone. I moved toward the path that led to the gravel parking lot where I had seen the cab drop me off earlier. I was almost there when I heard a familiar voice behind me, soft, confused, deeply kind. "Gramps?" I turned to see Molly standing in her bare feet, holding her heels in one hand, her dress slightly askew from hours of celebration. Her eyes widened when she saw the state I was in. "You're leaving?" she asked. I nodded. "I've done what I came to do." She bit her lip, stepped closer. "You didn't stay for dinner." "You didn't even dance with me." I looked at her, and for a brief moment everything around us dissolved. The music, the guests, the tent, the tension. And we were back in my garage when she was 10 years old, sitting on an overturned bucket while I showed her how to change a tire. The world so much simpler and full of wonder. "I don't think your mother wants me here," I said finally. "She can deal with it," Molly answered. "It's my wedding." But then her voice faltered. "She's been different lately, controlling, ever since Grandma died." I nodded slowly. "She lost something that made her human," I said quietly. "And sometimes when people lose that, they turn cold to survive." Molly reached out and touched my hand. "You're not cold, Gramps." "No," I said. "But I'm tired." She looked like she might cry, and I couldn't bear it, not after everything. So I pulled a folded envelope from my jacket pocket and handed it to her. "Open this later, not tonight, when you're alone." She took it without question, held it to her chest like it was made of glass, then hugged me one last time. I could feel her ribs, her warmth, her youth pressing into the worn-out fabric of my old suit, and I knew in that moment that not everything had been lost. I called the cab again. This time the driver was someone else, an older man named Leroy, who didn't speak much but adjusted the passenger seat to make room for my legs and helped me with the door. The ride home was quiet. I looked out at the trees passing like ghosts in the window, the last light of the day bleeding across the highway, and I thought about how silence could be both a punishment and a gift. When we arrived at my house, the porch light was on, likely set by Diane before she left that morning, a routine flick of a switch, not a gesture of care. I paid Leroy, tipped him well, and stepped out into the dusk. Every step from the car to the door was like dragging chains behind me, but I made it. I made it all the way inside, locked the door behind me, sat down in the chair by the window, and let my body unravel. I don't remember how long I sat there, but eventually I fell asleep, still in my wedding clothes, my cane leaning against the armrest, the cat curled beside me like a silent witness. When I woke the next morning, the suit was wrinkled and my body felt like someone had beat me with a bat, but I didn't care. I had walked Molly down the aisle. I had defied them. And now I waited for the fallout. It came sooner than I expected. That afternoon there was a knock at the door. I knew it was Diane before I opened it. Her knock had always been too firm, too precise, like she was announcing authority rather than asking entry. She stepped inside without waiting, dressed in black slacks and a white blouse, her face scrubbed of all the softness she usually applied like makeup. "We need to talk," she said. I gestured to the couch, but she remained standing. "What you did yesterday was irresponsible," she began. "You put yourself in danger. You disrespected the plans we had in place. Molly was upset." "No, she wasn't," I interrupted. "She thanked me." Diane's mouth twitched. "That's not the point." "You embarrassed yourself. You embarrassed me." I looked at her, really looked, and saw not anger but fear. She was afraid of something. I couldn't place it yet, but it was there, hiding behind her eyes like a shadow. "What are you really upset about?" I asked. "That I didn't sit quietly where you put me?" She didn't answer, just walked to the bookshelf and stared at the row of photo frames, most of them dusty, untouched. She reached out and picked up the wedding picture of me and Lorna, black and white, slightly faded, but still full of life. "You used to be different," she said. "Before Mom died." "So did you," I replied. She set the frame down too carefully, as if afraid it might explode. "We're not doing this again," she said. "We've made arrangements for your comfort. Gerald and I, we're trying to make things easier." "Whose comfort?" I asked. "Yours or mine?" She turned toward me, and for the first time I saw tears forming. But they weren't born of sadness. They were frustration, perhaps guilt, perhaps something worse. "I just wanted a peaceful day," she said, "and you turned it into a statement." "Sometimes a statement is all a man has left," I replied. She left soon after, without saying goodbye, without hugging me, without even petting the cat like she used to. I stood in the doorway and watched her car disappear down the street, and I knew then that something had shifted permanently between us. There would be no repair, no apology. Whatever bridge had once connected us had collapsed under the weight of too many quiet betrayals. And though I didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning. The chair was only the first thing they would take. The days that followed were eerily quiet, a silence not of peace but of surveillance, like being watched through soundproof glass. I resumed my ordinary routines, feeding the cat, heating the same oatmeal I never finished, sitting by the window where the sunlight bent through the blinds in stripes across the floor. But beneath the ordinary beat of those days, something had shifted. I felt it in the way the phone rang more often, always from unknown numbers, never with a voicemail. I felt it in the way my front gate creaked late at night, and then again before dawn, never long enough to catch a face, but just enough to stir my sleep. One morning I woke to find the recycling bin had been turned upside down and all its contents scattered across the sidewalk. The cat hissed at the door for no reason I could find. I chalked it up to nerves at first, to paranoia, old age, whatever phrase Diane would use to disqualify my instincts. But I knew, deep in the gut that had never failed me in war or marriage, that something had begun. A quiet campaign, a process, and I wasn't supposed to notice until it was already over. A week later I received a letter, not in the mailbox, but slipped through the crack in the storm door, no stamp, no return address. The envelope was thick, beige, the kind that usually comes from offices with linoleum floors and people in clip-on badges. Inside was a typed form from a legal firm I'd never heard of. The header read, "Petition for limited guardianship of Harold M. Ellison." I read the words over and over again as if repetition would somehow change them, soften their edges. But the meaning was clear. Diane had begun legal proceedings to have me declared partially incapacitated, just enough to take control of my medical decisions, my finances, my property. Not a full declaration, not dramatic enough for scandal, just a quiet shuffling of authority, masked as concern. I flipped to the second page, and there it was, her signature, the boxes checked, the claims vague but insidious. Memory decline. Mobility limitations, risk of self-harm due to non-compliance. Words that sounded like safety but tasted like betrayal. The final page listed the proposed guardian, Diane L. Keating, daughter. I didn't call her. I didn't scream. I didn't even tear up the letter. I placed it flat on the kitchen table and stared at it while the kettle hissed and the cat purred at my feet. I thought about the day Molly was born, about the trembling of Diane's hand as she held her daughter for the first time. I remembered how she cried and whispered, "I don't know if I'll be a good mother." I had placed my hand on her shoulder and said, "Then love her harder than you think you can." That's always the right direction. I remembered how Diane had nodded, had leaned into me, not as a daughter to a parent, but as a person to another person, flawed and afraid and hopeful. That moment had felt real. And now I was a case file in a system that processed old men like leaky faucets, quietly turned off until no one noticed the drip. I contacted an attorney the next day. His name was Mark Renner, a quiet man with steel-gray hair and a reputation for defending elder rights. We met in his office above a bakery downtown, and he listened without interruption as I laid everything out. The missing wheelchair, the wedding, the petition, the years of slow erasure. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "They always start with safety," he said. "That's the language they use. It sounds benevolent, protective. But what they're after is control." I asked him what my chances were. He said we'd have to prove competence through an independent medical evaluation, neurological, psychological, and cognitive tests. "Are you willing to go through all that?" he asked. I looked at him and answered without hesitation. "I walked my granddaughter down the aisle without help. I'll walk through this too." He nodded. "Then let's make them regret underestimating you." The next week was a blur of appointments, tests, questions asked by people in lab coats who looked at me the way people look at relics in museums, curiously, cautiously, as if afraid I might crumble under scrutiny. They asked about dates, locations, sequences, names. I recited full addresses I hadn't used in decades, listed every U.S. president in order from Truman to the current one, corrected the psychiatrist when he mispronounced hippocampus. I walked across rooms, solved puzzles, named animals in alphabetical order. I felt like a trick pony in a courtroom circus, but I did it. Every test, every indignity, because the alternative was to be silenced forever. During this time, Diane didn't call. Gerald didn't visit. Molly sent a text, simple, brief. "I don't understand what Mom's doing, but I'm here if you need me." I didn't reply. I didn't want her caught in the crossfire. That weekend I visited the bank and requested full transaction reports for the past 6 months. I highlighted every withdrawal made under Diane's name using the power of attorney. She had slipped into a document I had signed years earlier, thinking it was for emergency medical decisions. The amounts weren't massive, but they were frequent. $300 here, $600 there, a $1,200 payment to a catering service the day before the wedding. I gathered the documents and brought them to Mark. "It's a pattern," he said. "Not big enough for charges, but enough to paint a picture." We added it to the file. The hearing date came quickly. It was scheduled for 10 a.m. in a courthouse I hadn't visited since paying a speeding ticket in 1973. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled walls, high windows, a faint smell of mildew and bureaucracy. Diane sat at one table with a lawyer I didn't recognize, younger, polished, wearing a pitying smile. I sat with Mark, who wore the same calm expression he had at our first meeting. The judge, a woman in her 60s, entered and looked at me with clear eyes. "Mr. Ellison, are you able to speak on your own behalf?" she asked. "I am," I said. My voice didn't tremble. Over the next hour the room filled with paperwork, arguments, counter-arguments. Diane's lawyer cited concern for my increasing confusion. Mark submitted the evaluation reports, 3 separate specialists attesting to my full cognitive function. I listened as they debated my capacity as if I weren't in the room, as if my decades of work and marriage and sacrifice could be reduced to bullet points and checkbox forms. Finally, the judge looked at me. "Mr. Ellison, would you like to make a statement?" I stood slowly, gripping the edge of the table for balance. "Your Honor," I began, "I may walk slower than I used to. I may forget where I put my glasses, but I remember how to love. I remember how to stand when someone tries to push me down. And I remember that I raised a daughter who used to be kind, before she decided that comfort was more important than dignity. I don't need to be protected from my life. I need to be allowed to live it." The judge was silent for a long time. Then she nodded and ruled in my favor. The petition was denied, the guardianship dismissed. I had won. But victory came with its own kind of grief. I returned home not in triumph, but in exhaustion. That night I received a voicemail from Diane. Her voice was cold, clipped. "I hope you're satisfied. You humiliated me in court. You've broken this family. I don't know who you are anymore. I deleted the message without listening to the rest. The next morning I found my front gate ajar. The lock had been snapped. Inside the yard, my garden hose had been turned on and left running, flooding the flower bed I had tended for 6 years. The cat was missing. I found him later behind the shed, soaked and shivering. That's when I realized it wasn't over. This wasn't just about control. This was about punishment, and it had only just begun. In the days that followed the court's ruling, I felt no triumph, only a kind of weary clarity, like the light you see after a storm has flattened the landscape and revealed every fault line in the ground. Diane didn't speak to me again, not even through third parties, not even through Molly. She simply vanished from my life, a retreat not marked by apology or shame, but by silence and pettiness. And the silence had weight to it. My trash bins stopped being collected without explanation. My prescription refills were mysteriously delayed. The Meals on Wheels service that used to come twice a week began skipping deliveries. When I called the coordinator, a polite young woman named Jenny, she hesitated and said they had received a notice from a family member that I had moved out of state. I had to bring my ID in person to the office to reestablish service. "You're not the first," she said under her breath, as she processed my reinstatement. "Elder sabotage happens more than people think." I didn't ask what she meant. I already knew. Every inconvenience, every delay, every small act of redirection, it all had fingerprints, even if Diane's weren't visible. I had won the legal battle, yes, but the emotional war had shifted underground into quieter territory, where things could be done to you without ever being said to you. And so, I began making preparations of my own. First, I changed my will. I removed Diane entirely. No caveats, no explanations, just a clean deletion. In her place, I named Molly as sole beneficiary, not because I wanted revenge, not even out of punishment, but because she had shown me again and again that the connection between us was still rooted in something real. I also established a small trust in Lorna's name to fund scholarships for students entering geriatric nursing programs. It wasn't a grand gesture, just enough to plant a flag of memory where someone might see it. Then I made copies of the bank reports, the guardianship petition, and every correspondence related to the attempted takeover. I gave one set to my attorney, one to Molly, and I stored the third in a fireproof lockbox under the floorboards of my bedroom closet. I wasn't preparing for retaliation. I was preparing for survival, the kind that elderly people are rarely allowed to talk about, the kind that doesn't look like heroism but like folding your clothes neatly before you pack your bag. The final straw came 2 weeks later, when I received a notice from the county assessor's office informing me that my property taxes had been flagged for review due to an anonymous report of the house being inhabited unsafely. I knew immediately what it meant. I'd seen this tactic before in other families, heard it whispered about at the VA center or in the halls of the rehab facility, the slow erosion of legal independence through code enforcement, welfare checks, suspicious 911 calls. I called Mark and told him I was leaving, not fleeing, not hiding, just leaving. He asked where I would go, and I told him about the veteran housing complex across town, a modest but dignified building with a waiting list I had quietly joined the year before. I had received a call 2 days prior that an apartment had opened up. I accepted, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I finally understood that sometimes dignity means choosing your own distance, not clinging to what insists on erasing you. I packed slowly, methodically, boxing up what mattered and giving away what didn't. I left the furniture, I left the porch swing, I left the photos of Diane's childhood on the hallway walls. I brought only what still had meaning: Lorna's letters, Molly's school drawings, my medals, my cane. I moved in on a Wednesday. The apartment was small but clean. The building had other veterans, quiet, kind men who nodded at me in the hallways, who understood what it meant to carry history in your bones. There were no ramps to unfold, no family members to judge the way I folded a blanket or how slowly I walked to the mailbox. I bought a used recliner and placed it by the window. The cat took to it immediately, and by evening it already felt more like home than the house ever had since Lorna died. That weekend I wrote a letter to Molly. Not an email, not a text, but a real letter. I told her where I had gone and why. I didn't curse Diane or assign blame. I just explained that I had reached the edge of what could be repaired, and rather than live inside the rot, I had stepped out of the house and into my own breath again. I included the new address and a spare key. I didn't expect a response. But 3 days later, she arrived. She didn't knock. She just walked in, holding a pie tin wrapped in foil, her hair tied back, no makeup, eyes red but fierce. She looked around, nodded slowly, then sat beside me in silence. We didn't speak for nearly 5 minutes. Then she said, "Mom's trying to find you." I didn't answer. She continued, "She's angry. She says you've poisoned me against her." I turned my head. "Have I?" She shook her head. "Number. She did that herself." I watched her carefully. There was no melodrama in her voice, just exhaustion, the kind that comes from realizing someone you love is not who you thought. "I found the forms," she added. "The bank withdrawals. The guardianship stuff. I had no idea." I nodded. "Now you do." She looked down at her hands. "What do you want me to do?" I took a breath. "Nothing. Just don't forget me. That's all I want." She looked up, and in her eyes I saw Lorna again, defiant and bright, full of grace that wasn't taught but inherited. "I won't," she whispered. As she left, she placed the pie tin in my fridge. "It's blueberry," she said. "Grandma's recipe," I smiled and said. "Then it'll last about a day." She laughed through her tears and walked out into the dusk. I stood at the window and watched her drive away, knowing that this, finally, was what victory looked like. Not in courts, not in confrontations, but in the quiet assurance that someone still sees you as whole. Later that night, as I ate a slice of pie with the cat curled on my lap, I thought about how easily the world erases its old men. But I also thought about how powerfully one girl, now a woman, had refused to let me disappear. And for the first time in years, I slept the whole night through without waking in the dark. It's been 3 months since I moved. The seasons have begun to shift again, and the maple trees outside my new window are trading their green for rust and gold, the way they've always done, indifferent to the dramas of men. I sit each morning with my coffee the same way I did back in the old house, but now there is no silence that accuses me, only quiet that listens. The cat, older now, moves slower, climbs less, but still curls himself at my feet as though the past never happened. The other tenants in the building greet me with soft nods and few words. We are all people who have carried too much to speak often. One man lost both legs in Iraq. Another lost his son to suicide. We don't exchange stories. We exchange understanding. It's a better currency. Diane is not called. I no longer expect her to. Molly visits every Sunday. She brings groceries I don't need and stories I do. She sits cross-legged on the carpet like she did when she was 8 years old and tells me about the patients she cares for, about the absurdities of hospital bureaucracy, about how Travis burns toast every morning. She smiles more now, laughs easier. I think it's because she no longer feels torn between truth and loyalty. I never ask about Diane unless Molly brings her up, and when she does, it's in the past tense. She said this. She did that. Never. She says. Diane has become a story, not a participant, and maybe that's how it must be. I sometimes think about how close I came to disappearing, not from the earth, but from recognition, from personhood. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in soft edits, in words spoken for you instead of to you, in doors that are locked when you used to have keys, in memories rewritten by others until your version sounds suspect. I think about the wheelchair, how its absence revealed everything, how losing it was like being stripped of the last pretense of control, and how by standing I reclaimed something I hadn't even realized was gone. Not pride, not independence, but authorship, the right to write the last lines of your own story. I don't regret the fight. I don't regret walking down that aisle. I don't regret leaving the house that once held all my memories. I regret only that it took so long to see that comfort is not the same as love, and silence is not the same as peace. Some people will rewrite your story to make theirs easier. Others will sit beside you while you rewrite it yourself. This morning I received a letter in the mail written in the careful curling script of someone trying to sound composed. It was from Diane. Just one page, no apology, no confession. Just the words, "I hope you're well." Molly told me you're still stubborn. I suppose that's something I should have been proud of. I read it once and folded it carefully back into its envelope. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't respond either. Sometimes absence is the only answer that carries truth. Later, Molly stopped by with a photo album she had made, pictures from the wedding. She handed it to me with both hands like it was something sacred. On the cover, in gold letters, it read, "For the man who stood." I opened it slowly, and there in full color was the moment, her arm in mine, the guests watching, the church glowing with quiet wonder. She had framed it not as a memory of survival, but as a memory of triumph. I closed the book and smiled. I may not have many years left. My hands shake more often, my knees hurt when it rains, but I am not afraid. Not of dying, not of being forgotten. I have been seen, I have been heard, I have stood, and that, I think, is enough.